This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Robert, Kathryn, and I are thrilled to have Mike Stop Continues back with us. Hello, Mike. We are going to talk about guiding your reader through narrative today. So, where to start? It's critical, obviously. Every sentence of narrative we write should be purposeful, and it should be guiding the reader deeper into the story, and how we craft it will structure the story. It will structure surprises, suspense, reveals. So, Mike, you suggested this topic, so why don't you kind of flesh out that introduction?
Sure. I have, when reading other people's writing, I've got this pet peeve, and it's when moments of time, not necessarily, obviously I'm not talking about flashbacks, but when moments of time happen out of order, it just drives me nuts because it pulls me out of it. It's sometimes confusing, and it ruins the drama of the situation. So as an example, she ran right after the gun went off. And that drives me nuts because the gun went off first and then she ran, right? And so no matter how you want to structure your sentence, the gun needs to appear in my mind before she running appears in my her running in my mind appears. And I think that when you do that, it actually opens up a lot of avenues for you to work with it. Once you put things in the right order, then you're free to like add suspense or surprise or drama to those moments. But when they're muddled up, you don't have access to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that specific example is what I call a sequencing issue. It's also a pet peeve of mine, because clearly the gun going off triggered her running. So, and I think the issue with that is that writers think of things as happening simultaneously. But in writing, there's this old adage that the faster something happens in life, the slower it happens on the page. And that's because it takes words to break down these events and show them to the reader in a properly sequenced way with added suspense and dramatic tension and, leading up to a reveal and such. And so that requires a carefully structured, crafted narrative that is going to present to the reader this, image or sound, depending on how it's revealed, of the gun, her awareness of the gun going off, her reaction to the gun going off. And so all of that might happen in a millisecond, but on the page that could be a half-page paragraph.
Right. I wonder how much of this is because of the way that the writer was writing, like the way that they were thinking about, I need her to run. Oh, why is she running? It's because the gun went off, and then it's sloppily revised. You know what I mean? Like you're writing in flow, and you just are writing, oh, this is this, and oh, why did that happen? Oh, this is why it happened, and you didn't actually take the time to go back and, like you said, think about the sequence. And it's interesting to think about how many tools as a writer you're missing, because if you're just writing in that sort of, oh yeah, kind of a way, you know what I mean?
I think it's a factor of the flow state that you like to get into when you're drafting, especially. And I know certainly for me, I write to the movie in the head, like many writers might. And so those visual images, they're fast. And so catching them and nailing them to words on the page isn't always easy, because sometimes that can get you out of flow if you stop to write the lengthy part. So I think as you become more skilled, you might put, she ran, the gun went off and she ran. And you go, I need to expand on that. Quick note on the side, keep going, because you know that if you stop too long, you'll lose the visuals of the actual drama of the scene you're trying to write. And I suspect what happens is that those that haven't been through a fairly rigorous editing process, whether it be an external editor or self-editing, haven't learned to pick up on those patterns. And when you do, then they're relatively easy to correct, but probably not in first draft.
Yes, yeah, but I love that you mentioned the movie of the mind, because it's perfectly acceptable to say she ran because the gun went off. And then your listener or reader will mentally flip-flop those events, but you would never have a play or a movie in which a woman starts running and then you hear a bang, right?
Right.
That's not how the movie plays out. That's not how the action happens. And so if you, in revision, go back to that thought of what's the movie, what's the play, the action on the stage, gun, run. Yeah. Not not the other way around.
Yeah, Robert, I definitely agree with you on with lots of stuff, you can't focus too much on it in your first draft because you do want to stay in flow. But I think that as you grow as an author, you start to do the things that you trained yourself to revise in your first drafts. And it's, exactly. It's sort of, but I think the reason that this is such a impediment is that art, to me, is great art, imitates life as best as possible, not, or as dramatically as possible. And when you have stuff out of order, you don't feel like it's life anymore. You feel like it's something else, right? Now you're looking at words rather than being immersed in the story. And that's the reason I think that this is so important to get right. In addition to the fact that you're free to play with it once you reorganize it, right? Because for instance, if the gun goes off first, then you can decide what to do about the gun in between the gun going off and her running, and that's something that you don't have access to if they're swapped. Sorry.
We all need thinking breaks every once in a while. Okay, hang on. Collect that thought.
I think Mike must have just heard a gun going off in the room.
Yeah. Well, you had mentioned some tools. Can we go back to the tools that you get to use if you have the things in the right order? Like what sort of tools you get to access as a writer then that can help increase the power of your narrative?
Yeah, I came up with an example for this one. It's so my example for this is the bad version is Hero's head flew back when Buddy punched him in the nose, right? So obviously it's out of order. It doesn't work. It's like his head could have flown back for any reason at that point, right?
Right.
And it's sort of after the fact. There's no drama to it. There's no implicit question in that, right? Because you're confused, and then you know why you were confused rather than having a question and then an answer to it.
It's reversing the action-reaction pairing. You're giving the reaction and then stating the action as an after fact, which doesn't work.
So a better way to say it, and I wouldn't say this is just the starting point, right, is Buddy punched Hero in the nose and Hero's head flew back, right? So at least now it's in the right order. So we have what happened and then what was the effect of it. So there's only a teeny tiny question, and the question is what was the effect, but it's there.
Right.
You could add to it, right? So you could say Buddy threw his fist forward, period. Now you have a question. What happens? What does Buddy's fist do next, right? And so you could have after that Hero rolled sideways, just narrowly avoiding a broken nose, or you could have Hero heard his nose snap as he stumbled back, blood pooling in the back of his throat, right? So you have a series of things that happen in the exact order that they'd happen in. You'd hear the sound of your nose snap before you feel the feeling of your nose, right? And then you feel the blood pooling in the back of your throat. The order is there. Still, though, I don't think that's great. I'm just saying that that's a way to you putting a break in there gives you the opportunity to add drama to it. For suspense, you slow it down, right? So you say Buddy threw his fist forward, then period. Hero clenched his fist, knowing it was too late to roll away. Period. So now we slow down the action. We say, we're in a moment where something's going to happen, and we know what's going to happen, but what can we do about it, right? And then we say, so Hero threw his leg forward. So there's a response, and we know that two things now are going to happen, and we don't know what the effects are yet, but we know that two things are going on. And so then what? The two blows landed together. Okay, so now we know the two blows landed, but we don't know the effect. Finally, Hero heard his nose snap as he stumbled back, but he's screaming from the knee to his balls. Boom. So now we have the full resolution of what happened after dragging it out, probably for a little bit longer than it required. And then one more example. This one's for surprise. So basically, surprise is rather than slowing it down, it's by misleading the reader. So you do something, for instance, Buddy threw his fist forward and Hero rolled sideways. Now the question is, does rolling sideways work? It seems like he got away. So Buddy threw his fist forward, and Hero rolled sideways. Period. Right into Buddy's raised knee. Period. Not. I mean, it's not a great sentence. Sorry. That's 5 minutes ago. But the idea is that like you surprise the reader by pointing them in one direction while leading them in another. Right. And those are all things. Again, sorry to harp on this, but you just don't have access to them when you don't have things in the right order. You can't untangle.
Right. I think those are great examples. And it goes back to that adage of when it happens, the faster it happens in life, the slower it happens on the page, because our brains compute things so fast that, your example of all those sentences with, he sees the punch coming, he clenches his fist, what is he going to do? It's completely realistic that our hero is going to go through that entire process in that, moment before the punch lands on his nose or before he's able to roll away. And so it does build suspense in the reader's mind. It does add dramatic tension to the scene, and all of that is missing when you either just have Buddy threw a punch and Hero's nose cracked, or, Buddy's head flew back. Hero's head flew back because Buddy punched him, right? So I actually think those are great examples.
Yeah, I also a note about the time spent on the page. I know I like reading action, and I like reading action where there are things like fist fights. It's quite fun. Sword fights, gun fights, I don't care. Just fights. Put them on the page.
Violence.
And I think as a reader, if it's done well, then the narrative prior to that builds you up to it. You know it's coming. And we won't necessarily talk about how that happens in this particular call, but when you get to the point where there is the action, it's always disappointing to me if it happens too fast, because as a reader, your heart is pounding. You're almost ripping the thing off the page because you can't wait to see how does the hero get out of this or suffer badly. And if it happens in two sentences, okay.
Yeah, it's dramatic letdown. It's anticlimactic.
So actually, as I think as an author, sometimes we're fearful of expanding it too much in case it loses pace. But you have to recognize that the reader might be hurtling towards that scene at breakneck pace. Right. And so putting it apart like that gives you the delicious feeling of what it's like to have that slow motion, Matrix style fighting, but actually doesn't really happen that slowly when you're reading, because you're kind of paging through, going, oh, what's happening? What's happening? You have to remember, I think, that the reader experience is different to the writer's experience there as well.
Right. Well, and I think it's really important to note that pacing is not about brevity. Writing short descriptions does not up your pace. It ups how quickly readers can turn pages, maybe, but pace is about reader engagement. So something is fast-paced when you're glued to it, and you can't, you're just dying to know what's going to happen next, and you can create that fight scene with rich sensory details and, blow-by-blow descriptions and still maintain a fast pace. It's that excitement and that pull to be in the moment in any kind of scene, but fight scenes are nice, easy to discuss examples of this.
I'm curious about surprise. We can, and I'd also like to, so while we're on action scenes, we can talk about surprise, and I'd also like to throw into the mix, how do we use the narrative to do emotions in the right way? So, because I think that's something I struggle with more than anything. If I've ever got feedback on my early books, it's that I did the show don't tell quite well when it comes to anything choreographed, but when it came to things that were emotional, I would often just say he felt or she felt. Which obviously, I try not to do any more these days, but clearly that has been a struggle in the past. But just in terms of surprise, then. Because that's something that I've mentioned before on the podcast. You can get the jump surprise in horror movies. And they've got music, they've got camera cuts, they've got different angles that they can show. They've got dramatic irony. What are your thoughts, Mike, about how you use narrative to introduce surprise? I mean, you mentioned it a little bit before with Hero rolling into the knee.
Yeah, I have a similar I try to work with that a lot because I have a similar issue with like when you're reading, you always have a like a gentle awareness of the stuff coming up a few lines down, right? You're like you don't you don't recognize it until you reach one of those sections that's supposed to be a surprise. And so
Yeah.
I always try to find ways to like to weave it so that you end up with the surprise in a way that it's still surprising. But I think that the best I think the best way to do it is to sort of there's two ways. One, you bury the surprise in a big paragraph. So that's one way, and I got that way actually from Joe Hill. I find that he does it really well that way.
Okay.
But the other way is you just work with the fact that your reader is going to have some awareness that it's coming, and you just try to give it to them in a way that's still satisfying, right? So like you just like I mean I assume that this is true for all of you because you're all storytellers. When you're watching a TV show, if you really thought about it, you would know exactly what was going to happen next, right? Because you are storytellers. You know how stories go. I think it's the same thing here. It's like readers intuitively have that sense anyway. So like as long as you just promise to give them something that's a little bit outrageous in the surprise, makes the surprise extra worth it because it's not going to shock them like a horror movie. At least I haven't found a way yet.
Yeah. I think one way, as you were talking, Mike, an example came to mind of a time I was recently surprised in a TV show, watching Tin Star. The protagonist is a sheriff and total hardcore. So there's no surprise that he's hard drinking, hard shooting, beat him up, all that stuff. But his wife and children have seemed like a very just nice, loving family. And then we go to the scene where the sheriff is outside the house and he hears a gun go off. And he runs up to the door and throws it open. And there's his wife with a shotgun in her arms, and there's a dead snake on the floor of the house. And he just looks at her and says, "Nice shooting, Irish." And it's like, oh, wife/mom, she's a badass too. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Like there was no kind of backstory included to fill us into this side of her personality. So in that moment, when it came out, it was a wonderful surprise to discover who else this woman is. So we as writers can do that. We can keep something out of the reader's awareness until the moment when it's A, relevant and useful to the story, but B, provides that delightful surprise.
True, yeah. You can expose something that's well known to both of the characters, so they don't have to explain it, and make sense to them. But as a reader, you've got to then quickly join a few dots.
Yes.
And yes, that's a good point.
Yeah, and then this aspect of the mom-wife was further developed, so it wasn't like a one-off that didn't belong in the story. It was integral to who she was. It's just she didn't need to use a gun until that moment. So then it was this very fun reveal to the audience.
Yeah, and a nice bit of foreshadowing if you need that character to do something like that a bit later on as well.
Right. So the point is, don't use it just for the effect and then drop it.
No.
Keep it integral. Yeah.
One day I'm going to write a short story where a character walks in the room and it's filled with mantelpieces and guns over every topic.
Right.
That's funny.
Okay, how many guns need to
Which
go
one's
off in
gonna
Act
go
3, right? Chekhov would be proud.
But so another place that I actually find this particular problem is sometimes people put their dialogue tags way too late, especially the kind that convey something.
Yes.
I have a
Guilty.
rule that
When I read it back in revision, I go, "What? All that happened, and now she's feeling surprised."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and it was hard for me to find an example of it, but it's like 2 sentences, she screamed or something, where you're just like, her emotion could have been anything the whole time. So what I try to do is I never put it like one phrase is the furthest I go without putting that dialogue tag. It's like literally it could be half a sentence. Just one phrase is all the character gets before I give some indication of the emotion, if it's not clear from the previous paragraphs.
Right.
Well, that's
But
been my habit. It's been not making it clear through leading up, and so if let's say we're talking about the emotional reaction that you're trying to add with the dialogue tag, and I think that's personally is a bit of a lazy way of writing and leads to the Tom Swifty type thing anyway. So if you can do it, and what I've tried to train myself to do is so that to make it obvious from either the preceding paragraphs or scene, and then the type of dialogue. Without then having to add the dialogue tag, because I recognised that what I was doing is I was having to come in feeling like I needed to come in and add a dialogue tag, and it was coming in too late. So then I was repositioning it, and then it broke up the flow of the dialogue. And so really that's a surface problem. And what you're saying, Mike, is there's an underlying problem, which is that maybe it's not been set up correctly, or we're trying to make everything do too much work in the one sentence with a dialogue tag. And so, yeah, it's again, a revision problem perhaps, but once you pick up those ticks, your writing is cleaner, I think, in first draft.
Yeah, absolutely. Another place where I see this issue is when writers will have a character say something that needs to be addressed by the next character, but then they go into narrative exposition about the room or the body language or the whatever, and then you're like, 5 to 10 sentences later, character B responds, and I'm like, wait a minute, what are we talking about? I need to jump back up to that last dialogue line. So keep like with like, it's like that action-reaction pairing. He said, she said, okay, and now give us your description.
That's a real good one. For that I always try to I imagine, I don't know how to describe it. I imagine those little bits of dialogue as their own little entity, right? That when I look at them on the page, especially when I'm doing a story edit, so it's before I get into the weeds, I see those chunks. I try to not dig too deeply into them and keep them together because it's so important that they stay together.
Right. Yeah, it is very important not to lose the reader. You don't want to create a situation where your reader is going to forget what was said by the time you get to that response. So if a response is necessary, don't separate it from the first part. Yeah. All right, so surprises, suspense, anything to say about that, or does that part and parcel with surprising the reader?
I would just say it's slowing things down. And you slow. Obviously, it's not just slowing things down, but I think that's the key to it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Using that narrative to draw the reader into the movement and through the movement.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess it's really just, we've talked a lot about putting things in the right order, but putting things in the right order doesn't necessarily mean saying everything that happens. It just means, having the right order. Where suspense is more about saying more of the things that happened, right? It's sort of like, pulling the reader deeper into the experience by giving them more of the, visual, auditory, all of the experience of being there.
Yeah, so more sensory details to bring the experience to life. So not necessarily describing everything, but describing the key things that create a sense of anticipation for what we feel is coming. We don't know what it is yet. That's the key to suspense. It's like, okay, something's coming. What is it? What is it? So bringing that experience to life for the reader. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask a nitty-gritty, editing revision question about how tools that you guys use for identifying this in your own writing, and we've talked a lot about how to kind of fix it on the back end, but how can you find it and identify it, or identify patterns of what you're doing in order to fix it?
So
yeah, go ahead, Mike.
What I do is I literally just step through every beat that happens in the story as I'm reading through it. So this mostly happens in one of the earlier drafts, right? Where I'm just saying, what happens next? What happens next? What happens next? And it's easy to see where things get muddled. Or sometimes it works the opposite way, where a chunk of text isn't working, and that's when I go into it and I say, what, like, what order do these things need to be in for them to work? Sometimes also I just, when you've got like a problem paragraph, I just rewrite it from the ground up, and it's sometimes easier than fixing it is just rewriting it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think another tool is to look at the movement, whether that's a scene or a chapter or just a passage, maybe even just half a page, and say, what am I trying to accomplish here in terms of affecting the reader? Am I trying to establish a certain mood? Am I trying to build suspense towards something coming later? Am I trying to, have a fast-paced action scene here that's going to get our blood pumping as readers? And then now I've got my goal in mind. So, okay, is this passage doing it? Is it too detailed to be fast-paced? Is the mood just not lacking or just not coming through because I haven't found the key sensory detail that's going to create that mood yet? So identifying the goal of how will this affect the reader can help me kind of analyze what's working and what isn't. Because if you don't have that goal in mind, your description might read just fine. It's a description. Well, but what's wrong, right? It's not working toward that goal.
And of course, now that we all have that Post-it note, you can always look up at that.
That's
right.
right.
That's not working because this has got nothing to do with the theme. I do a couple of things specifically as well. I will print it out and read it, and maybe in a cafe or a different location, and read it. I try and read as a reader, which is really hard actually because you do get jumped out of it, but that's okay. And then I'll also produce a Kindle version, read it on my iPad on the Kindle app, because that seems to pop out different things, and that will help me. In the final polishing, I'll actually use the app that reads it out, and have it read very fast as well, because that can be a different way to pop things out. You figure out sections that don't flow, or you get bored, or you drift off to sleep. Because I think as you got to turn yourself into a reader again to work out, okay, something's not working here. So my first tip, I think, Kathryn, is you've got to find out where it's tripping you up before you're necessarily looking for the what of the tripping up. It's just, what is it doing to me first? And then I will come back to it. And sometimes, there might be a whole slew of things that don't work in there. So I don't know if there's a specific tool I would use other than straightforward narrative drive. Is there an inciting incident? Is there some tension or conflict building? And is there a resolution or the action reaction or some tool like that to try and dissect whatever it is, or am I just going to go through look at verbs, or will I just go through look at dialogue tags, and then that's where the problem is. I wasn't seeing it before because it was in too big a lump. And so I think sometimes, like Mike says, you just got to pull apart the beats.
Yeah, and I think it's important to get away from the movie that's running through your mind. So doing that by resting the manuscript or listening to your computer read it, so you can't, play those parts in your own voice and such. Whatever will help you step back from it in that way will help you to identify, where am I, messing up my sequencing or misplacing my dialogue tags or some of those other things we've talked about. Did that satisfy you, Kathryn? Are we missing anything here?
No, I think that's great. Yeah, it's just ways of thinking about how that process works. You know what I mean? Because finding the problems is half the problem. You know what I mean? Like if you can't find them, then you can't fix them.
Absolutely. So I think writers make the same mistakes throughout their manuscripts until somebody points it out to them, and then you have to train yourself to recognize them when you're revising your work, and then you can train yourself to recognize them as you're writing, and then you'll be able to not make those mistakes. So it's kind of a process of recognition, because you can't spot what you don't see, So having an outside reader might be crucial, or you might be able to accomplish that through like the audio trick or something. And using highlighters, I think, is great. Read with a highlighter so you can't skip over something. It's like note taking while you listen. You've got to tune in differently. So, all right, I'm going to read this scene and I'm going to highlight any dialogue takes that are off. I'm going to read the scene and I'm going to watch for, dialogue that's explaining too much stuff the characters know. I should give that information to the reader differently so the dialogue stays natural. So that will help you just tune in.
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of. I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
That's an interesting kind of focused practice, right? Where you're focusing in on one thing and you're giving yourself rapid feedback about it, right?
Yeah.
You're forcing yourself to pay attention to it and then fix it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, on that point, I use there's not very many different colors, but so that I don't have to stop and add a note and stop my reading when I'm reading in the Kindle app, I'll highlight the portion of text. If it's mere grammar, then I'll give it red because it just got to be fixed. If it's tripping me up, I might give it blue, and if it needs something specific, then I might give it a yellow and then come back to it and add a note. But just anything so that I don't get too stuck in the one moment, because I think you do have to keep some momentum up. But I'm answering Kathryn's question because I know she'll be listening after, even though we've had to wave goodbye to her. Also, I think knowing your genre and setting and some of the conventions may help as well in a more global sense. And I'm thinking of a specific example where I'd written space opera and in my mind had this absolutely stupendous battle cruiser that had been abandoned in space, and these space pirates come across it. And when I reread the scene, I realized that there was something missing in there that almost any reader would be just gobsmacked that it wasn't there, which was a description of the thing.
Right, that is important.
I can remember reading some of the classic Asimov or Arthur C. Clarke type things where they stumble on this most awe-inspiring thing, and then you get a blow by blow kind of it's not slow. I mean, it's done obviously with a deft hand. So I used them circulating this thing which was rotating and having to match speed, and then going across port after port after hatch after hatch after hatch. God, how big is this thing? And I left all that out because in my mind I had it.
Yeah.
In my mind, it was this most inspiring thing. And you think, that's going to take me forever to describe that on the page. It'd be boring, but it's not. It's a convention. You're going to have a space opera where they discover one of the sector's biggest, baddest fighting, mother Fs of a ship. And you better give it some time on the page, But the mere fact that I'd done that then led me to be able to describe some of the action sequences once they got into the thing more effectively as well, because I had a sense in my mind as to how I'd describe this to the reader. So I think that is very peculiar, I think, to that particular setting, and certainly one of the conventions of military sci-fi. You're going to have these big, big objects that are powerful, that are controlled by humans in like that. So I think genre and setting is helpful as well as another tool to use as you read through. Have I hit the marks that a reader's probably going to expect, and have I done that in a way that's inevitable but still surprising, and using some of Mike's techniques in there.
Right, definitely. Is there anything you want to add, Mike, about using narrative to guide your reader through your story?
No, I feel like we covered it.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening. Please remember to rate, review, and share. And you can find Mike at mikestopcontinues.com.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.